The academy grounds stretched wide under the morning sun, its dirt paths already packed with recruits lining up for what was said to be the hardest endurance drill yet. The air felt heavy with tension, a mix of dust and nervous breath. Each recruit carried a heavy pack strapped tight across their shoulders, filled with weights that dragged at their muscles with every step. Some whispered under their breath, others stretched stiffly, preparing themselves for the long test ahead. Alien instructors, taller and stronger than most of the humans, stood at the edges with sharp eyes, their presence making the silence even more intense. They were there not only to monitor progress, but also to judge who had the will to endure. When the whistle finally blew, the line surged forward, boots pounding against the ground. The recruits moved in rhythm, some stumbling early under the sudden strain of the packs. Dust rose around them, clinging to sweat, making the air thicker with every stride. In the middle of the group was one young human trainee, shoulders straining beneath the load but eyes fixed straight ahead. She wasn't the fastest, nor the strongest, but her determination kept her feet moving at the same steady pace. She knew this drill wasn't only about strength, it was about spirit. About proving that she belonged among those who doubted her kind's place in this academy. As the trail stretched on, murmurs spread as a few recruits began to slow. Their packs seemed heavier with every step, breaths coming out sharp and uneven. Some looked over at the alien instructors, almost hoping for mercy, but no such help came. The instructors watched silently, their expressions unreadable, their hands folded behind their backs. This silence made the pressure worse, as if every step was being weighed and judged. The human trainee felt the burn in her legs, the fire in her lungs, but she locked her focus on the ground just ahead, forcing herself to keep moving. Each time doubt crept in, she reminded herself why she was here, to show that her kind could endure the same trials, could carry the same burdens, could fight with the same heart. Around her, the sound of labored breaths mixed with the rhythm of marching feet. Some recruits whispered encouragement to themselves, others bit back frustration. The human trainee said nothing, but her silence carried a kind of resolve that even the cubs trailing at the edge of the field seemed to notice. Their curious eyes followed her, tilting their heads as if sensing something unspoken in her quiet struggle. She felt the weight crushing against her shoulders, her back aching with every movement, but she did not falter. Instead, she pressed forward with a steadiness that was almost defiant. By the time the path curved into the open fields, the sun had climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. Sweat rolled freely, dripping into eyes and stinging raw skin. The packs felt twice as heavy now, but still the human trainee did not break her stride. While others staggered and slowed, she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, determined that no matter how hard the drill became, she would not fall behind. It was this quiet determination, unnoticed by most, that would set the stage for what was to come. The heat grew heavier with each passing minute, as if the sun itself was testing the endurance of those below. Its burning light beat down on the recruits, their shadows stretching long on the dusty ground, each step raising small clouds that clung to their skin and stung their throats. The path seemed endless, winding forward without mercy, and many of the recruits had begun to stumble, their pace slowing despite their best efforts. Some let their packs drop slightly on their shoulders, adjusting straps in desperation, while others dragged their feet, their boots scraping against the dirt. But in the middle of the struggling line, the young human pressed forward, her face pale but set with quiet determination. Every part of her body screamed to stop. Her shoulders ached from the biting straps, her legs burned as though fire lived inside them, and her breath came in sharp bursts that barely filled her lungs. Yet she refused to let go of the rhythm she had built. One step, then another. She told herself that stopping, even for a moment, would mean defeat, and she would not allow that. Around her, voices rose and fell in frustration, recruits cursing the heat or their own weakness. Some cast glances toward the instructors, hoping for an early signal to end, but the alien watchers remained still, their piercing eyes following every movement with cold judgment. Not one of them stepped forward to help, and not one offered comfort. To them, this was the real test, not who could start the drill strong, but who could last when strength began to fail. The human trainee felt this truth deep in her bones, and though exhaustion tugged at her, she lifted her head and forced her body to answer the challenge. The pack on her back seemed to grow heavier with every stride, pressing her spine downward as though it wanted to bury her in the dirt. Her vision blurred at the edges, spots of light dancing across her eyes from the glare of the sun. Sweat soaked through her clothes, leaving dark patches that clung uncomfortably to her skin. A sharp pain stabbed at her side, and her knees trembled with each step, but still she did not stop. In her mind, she repeated the same thought like a shield. One more step. It became a rhythm, a lifeline. One more step, and then another. She had no strength to think beyond that, but it was enough to keep her moving. Other recruits noticed her persistence. Some were surprised, others even frustrated that she, who was not the strongest among them, continued without faltering when they themselves struggled. But she was not moving for their approval. She was moving because she carried something deeper inside, a stubborn refusal to give up no matter the cost. The cubs watching from the edge seemed to sense her struggle. They shifted uneasily, small paws tapping the ground as though they wanted to run alongside her. Their eyes stayed fixed on her small figure, carrying a burden almost too great for her body, but not too great for her will. As the sun reached its peak, the drill turned into a silent war between body and spirit. For the human, the battle was fierce. Her body was failing, trembling under the strain, but her spirit burned brighter, pushing her forward when logic said she should fall. She knew she was pushing too far, past the point of safety, but she also knew there was no turning back. Every step she took was a statement, a defiance against doubt. And though her strength waned, her will carried her on into the endless heat. Sweat poured down her forehead and slid into her eyes, blurring her vision and stinging like tiny sparks. She blinked hard, but the salt only made it worse. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her breaths shallow and rough as though her lungs could no longer take in enough air. Her legs, once steady and strong, began to tremble under the weight of the pack, each step heavier than the last. The ground beneath her seemed to stretch farther and farther, as if the path itself wanted to test her limits. Still, she pressed on. Pride and determination locked her forward, refusing to let her slow down or admit weakness. She had promised herself she would not be the one to collapse, not the one to fail, even though her body screamed with exhaustion. Nearby, the alien cubs marched in their own small line, usually full of playful energy, yet today they carried themselves with unusual calm. Their sharp eyes stayed fixed on her, watching her every movement. They sensed something was wrong. Her faltering steps, the tightness in her jaw, the way her shoulders drooped despite her stubborn effort to stand tall. Normally, they would nudge one another, leap about, or even distract the recruits with mischief. But now they moved with discipline, their heads low, their paws steady on the ground. It was as though they understood that something important was unfolding, and they were there not to play, but to witness. Her hands clenched tightly around the straps of her pack, knuckles pale with strain. Every time she tried to straighten her back, the straps dug harder into her shoulders, pressing into her skin as though they wanted to break her down. A sharp ache spread across her chest, and her knees wobbled, threatening to give way. She bit the inside of her lip to keep herself from groaning aloud, her pride refusing to let anyone hear her pain. Around her, some recruits had already slowed to a crawl, heads bowed, waiting for orders to rest. But she didn't look at them. She kept her gaze forward, staring at the horizon as if it alone could pull her onward. The instructors glanced at her from a distance. Their alien faces gave little away, but they noticed the strain. They had seen many collapse before, broken by drills just like this one, but something about the human struggle held their attention. They didn't step in, not yet. This was a test, and in their world, only those who walked to the edge of their strength could prove what lay beyond. Still, the cubs seemed to react differently. Their pace matched hers, slowing when she slowed, keeping close when her steps faltered. It was as if their small bodies instinctively aligned with her rhythm, protecting her in silence. Her throat felt dry, every swallow rough, and her vision blurred again with sweat. She knew she was close to her limit, but she refused to admit it. Deep inside, a quiet fear whispered that she might not last much longer. Yet louder than fear was her pride, the will not to let weakness show, not to fall while others watched. Each step forward became a battle, a slow war between body and spirit. And though her body faltered, her spirit still refused to bow. The path stretched endlessly before her, but she could no longer see it clearly. Her vision swam, dark spots flickering at the edges as the pounding of her heart grew louder than the sound of boots on gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last, her pack pressing down like a mountain on her shoulders. She tried to lift one foot, then the other, but her body had reached its limit. Her knees buckled, her balance wavered, and before she could catch herself, she stumbled forward. The ground rushed up, and with a harsh thud, she hit the earth, dust rising around her. Gasps filled the air. The sound of her fall cut through the steady rhythm of the drill, breaking the silence with its sharp finality. Flat on the ground, she clawed at the dirt, trying to push herself up. But her arms trembled and gave way. Her chest heaved as she dragged in shallow breaths, the air scraping her throat as though it were fire. Sweat drenched her skin, mixing with dust until her face was streaked and pale. She blinked rapidly, but the world kept spinning, tilting sideways and fading in and out. Her mind screamed for her to rise, to keep going, but her body refused to listen. The weight of exhaustion pinned her down harder than any burden she had ever carried. Around her, the other recruits froze in place. Their boots stopped mid-stride, their lines broken. No one had expected this, least of all from her, the one who had pushed so hard to keep going when others slowed. They exchanged uneasy glances, whispering under their breath. Some wanted to run forward to help her, but the unspoken rule of the drill held them back. They had been trained to wait for orders, to follow discipline, not to act on impulse. And so they stood, caught between fear and duty, unsure of what the right choice was. The instructors didn't move either. Their sharp alien eyes observed quietly, studying the human on the ground. To them, this was not failure but revelation, the moment when endurance broke and truth showed itself. They waited, stone still, their faces unreadable, as though the scene before them was part of a lesson only they understood. Yet their silence only made the air heavier, pressing on every recruit who watched. But the cubs reacted differently. The three small figures who had been marching near her side immediately slowed their pace and broke from their quiet formation. Their paws tapped the ground softly as they stepped closer, eyes wide with concern. They didn't hesitate or wait for orders. Their instincts guided them, pulling them toward the fallen human. For the first time, they looked less like trainees and more like protectors, circling around her as if forming a living shield. Their soft growls were not of play, but of warning, daring anyone to disturb her while she lay so vulnerable. The silence stretched, broken only by her ragged breathing and the faint sound of cubs shifting on their paws. The recruits stood frozen, the instructors unmoved, but everyone could feel it. The drill had changed. This was no longer just a test of endurance. Something deeper was unfolding, something that none of them had been prepared to witness. Before the instructors could even take a step, movement broke the tension. The cubs, small but fierce in their instincts, darted forward with surprising speed. Their paws barely touched the ground as they reached the collapsed human. But they did not act out of panic or confusion. Instead, with a strange sense of unity, they positioned themselves carefully around her, forming a tight circle as if they had rehearsed this moment all along. Their bodies were low, tails stiff, ears forward, every part of them alert. They shielded her, not just with their size, but with the raw presence of their stance, a silent promise that no harm would touch her while she lay defenseless. The recruits who had been frozen in shock now watched with wide eyes, their discipline broken by disbelief. None of them had expected the cubs, usually playful and full of energy, to react in such a protective way. These creatures had been seen as learners, not guardians, but the scene unfolding proved otherwise. Whispers rippled quietly through the ranks as the reality sank in. While the humans hesitated, it was the cubs who had acted first. Driven not by orders, but by loyalty and instinct. The instructor's gaze sharpened, but they still did not move. Their silence seemed deliberate, as though they were measuring every second of what happened. Their faces remained unreadable, but their eyes betrayed curiosity, as if this was the very outcome they had been waiting to witness. The stillness of their towering figures made the cubs' actions stand out even more, drawing every eye toward the circle they had formed. The fallen human, lying pale and weak in the dust, was no longer just another trainee in their eyes. She had become the center of something much greater. The cubs themselves were restless but determined. One pressed its nose gently against her arm, sensing the shallow rise and fall of her breath. Another crouched close to her head, its golden eyes scanning the faces around, daring anyone to step closer. The third stood slightly taller, letting out a low, rumbling growl that rolled across the silence, a warning not to interfere unless with care. Their bodies leaned inward toward her, creating not just a circle but a living wall that pulsed with courage. The air thickened with an emotion no one could quite describe. Fear, respect, and awe mixed together, holding everyone in place. Even the most hardened recruits could feel the meaning behind the cubs' response. It was not about strength, not about power, but about something deeper, something instinctive that cut through the rules of the drill. They had chosen to protect, and in that moment, their choice carried more weight than all the commands shouted in training. Time seemed to stretch as the cubs held their ground. The only sound the humans' uneven breathing and the soft scrape of claws shifting on the dirt. The world around her blurred, but within that circle, she was safe. What had started as a simple endurance test was no longer about running or survival. It had become a moment that revealed trust, loyalty, and an unspoken bond that none of the recruits, or even the instructors, would ever forget. The circle around the fallen human held firm, an unspoken shield that no one dared cross. The cubs, usually clumsy in play, stood with a discipline that surprised even the instructors. Their ears pressed back against their heads, their eyes sharp and unblinking, and their bodies tense like trained sentries. They did not snarl or lash out, but their stance alone was enough to warn everyone that they would not allow her to be disturbed. Each cub shifted only slightly, adjusting to cover any angle, as though they understood exactly what they were doing. This was not rebellion against the instructors or defiance of the drill. It was something deeper, a wordless expression of loyalty. The recruits whispered among themselves, unsure whether to step closer or remain still. Some looked to the instructors, waiting for a command, but none came. The instructors simply watched, their faces unreadable, as though this moment was a test in itself. The cubs were small compared to the towering aliens, yet their presence seemed far larger now, commanding respect in a way no shouted order could. Even the dust swirling in the heat seemed to pause, hanging in the air as silence stretched across the training field. The human lay motionless, her chest rising and falling weakly as exhaustion pulled her deeper into unconsciousness. To the recruits, she looked fragile, vulnerable, almost lost. But to the cubs, she was not weak. She was theirs, and that was enough to make them brave. Their protective stance told a story more powerful than any words could express. They did not see rank or species. They saw a companion, someone who had pushed herself beyond limits, someone who had earned a place in their world not through power, but through determination. And in that moment, they chose to guard her until safety returned. One cub lowered its head, nudging her arm gently as if reminding her she was not alone. Another shifted closer to her side, placing its small body almost against hers, creating warmth and comfort in the middle of the harsh training ground. The third stayed slightly ahead, eyes scanning every recruit, tail flicking in warning to anyone tempted to interfere. Their movements were not random. They were coordinated, instinctive, and undeniably loyal. The recruits who had once thought of the cubs as little more than trainees themselves now saw them in a different light. Minutes stretched like hours, and still the cubs did not falter. Sweat beaded on the brows of recruits who stood watching, feeling a strange mix of awe and guilt. They had hesitated when one of their own had fallen, but the cubs had not. They had acted instantly, without question, without waiting for permission. It was not out of duty, but out of something purer. Trust. When the sound of approaching medics finally broke the heavy silence, the cubs did not move aside at first. They stayed where they were, measuring the newcomers with the same sharp eyes. Only when they were certain that these strangers came with healing, not harm, did they ease their circle slightly, allowing access but never leaving her side. Their loyalty remained unshaken. Their presence a reminder that strength was not only in muscle or command, but also in the courage to stand guard for someone who could not stand for themselves. The sound of hurried footsteps broke the heavy silence as the medical staff rushed onto the field, carrying their equipment and urgency with them. Their faces were focused, their voices low but tense as they called for space. Yet the moment they approached, they were met not with clear access, but with 3 determined cubs standing firm. Their small frames were tense, bodies pressed together in a shield around the fallen human, ears back and eyes sharp, unwilling to allow anyone to get too close. The medic slowed, confused, glancing toward the instructors as if expecting an order to move the cubs away. But the instructors only stood in silence, observing. It was as if they knew that this was not their place to interfere. The cubs didn't bare teeth or growl, but the message in their stance was unmistakable. No one touches her until they are certain it is safe. One medic tried to step forward, speaking in a calm voice, but the cubs lowered themselves, bodies tightening, ready to block again. The human, barely conscious, stirred at the sound of voices. Her breathing was shallow, her strength fading, but she sensed the tension around her. Slowly, with great effort, she lifted her head just slightly and whispered. The word was faint, almost lost in the air, but the cubs heard it. They always heard her. Her voice was weak, but it carried the weight of trust. She told them it was all right, that they could step aside. At first the cubs hesitated, their instincts fighting against the idea of leaving her unguarded. But her tone, though frail, was steady, and it calmed them in a way nothing else could. Slowly, one cub moved back, glancing at her as if to confirm she truly meant it. The others followed, their bodies still tense, but their loyalty stronger than their fear. With heavy reluctance, they parted just enough to let the medics through, though they never moved far. They remained close, circling at a careful distance, their sharp eyes fixed on every action. The medics knelt beside her, opening packs, checking her breathing, and preparing to lift her onto a stretcher. They spoke quickly to one another, but even their efficiency carried an edge of respect now, as though they understood the cubs were still watching. Every time a hand touched her arm or adjusted her position, the cubs leaned forward slightly, ready to intervene if something seemed wrong. The recruit standing nearby whispered in awe. They had never seen such loyalty from creatures they once thought of as simply young trainees. It was clear now that these cubs were more than that. They were guardians born not of duty, but of choice. The human closed her eyes again as the medics worked, but her lips curved faintly in relief. She had not collapsed alone. Even in her weakness, she knew she was safe because of them. When the medics finally lifted her carefully onto the stretcher, the cubs moved with them, padding alongside, refusing to leave her even for a moment. The instructors exchanged quiet glances, none daring to break the sacred bond playing out before them. On that field, under the hot sun, everyone present understood that something powerful had just been proven. Loyalty could not be commanded, and respect could not be forced. It had to be earned, and this young human had earned it completely. The field was still buzzing from what had just happened. But in the middle of that quiet storm, the instructors only looked at one another, their expressions thoughtful and serious. They had trained recruits for years, both human and alien, drilling them with commands, strict routines, and endless repetitions of discipline. Yet what they had just witnessed wasn't the product of drills or orders. The cubs had not been told to protect her, nor had they been taught to stand in formation and block out the world. It came from something deeper, something the instructors could not quite define. They realized in that moment that the cubs had copied the very strength she had shown throughout the training, the calm determination, the way she endured pain without complaint, and the quiet dignity in her struggle. Even as her body failed, she had faced the challenge without bitterness, and the cubs had absorbed every bit of it. It was clear now that her influence had gone far beyond what the instructors had intended. She hadn't shouted commands or demanded obedience. She hadn't needed to. Her quiet strength had spoken louder than any drill ever could. The cubs, young and impressionable, had mirrored her behavior not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. In her resilience, they saw something worth following, something that discipline alone could never create. That realization struck the instructors more powerfully than the sound of any cannon or the weight of any lecture. For all their years of training, they had overlooked the simple truth that loyalty is earned through respect, not fear. The recruits standing on the sidelines felt the same weight settle on them. They had seen her push herself far beyond exhaustion, refusing to stop even when her body cried out. They had seen her fall, but they had also seen how the cubs responded, not with pity, not with mockery, but with protection. In those few tense minutes, the entire academy was reminded of what true strength looked like. It wasn't the loudest voice in the room or the one who barked the harshest orders. It was the person who kept going with quiet resolve, who inspired others simply by refusing to give up. As the medics carried her away, the cubs still close at her side, the instructors remained thoughtful. They knew this moment would echo far beyond the field. This was not just a story about a human who collapsed during training. It was a lesson written in silence, in actions, and in the bond between a girl and a group of alien cubs. The instructors did not speak, but the truth was clear to them all. The cubs had not just guarded her body, they had guarded the strength she had shown them, reflecting it back when she could no longer stand. It was proof that even in weakness, the human spirit had a way of leaving its mark, shaping others in ways no command could ever match. When she finally opened her eyes in the quiet of the medical ward, she expected to feel shame. The memory of falling in front of everyone still stung, and she thought others would see her collapse as weakness. Yet the first thing she noticed was the soft sound of laughter outside the door, the kind of laughter that carried relief rather than mockery. As she sat up, she saw flowers placed at her bedside, not by fellow recruits, but by the alien cubs who had guarded her. Word had traveled fast through the academy, faster than she imagined. Her collapse was no longer spoken of as failure, but as the moment that revealed something far greater. The story told in the training grounds was not about how she had fallen, but about how the cubs had stood, loyal and unshaken, because of the bond she had unknowingly built with them. The instructors, once strict and distant, now treated her with a quiet respect. They did not speak of her fainting or scold her for pushing beyond her limits. Instead, they mentioned how rare it was for the cubs to act on their own without orders, and how remarkable it was that they had done so for her. The recruits, too, looked at her differently. Many had trained beside the cubs for months without gaining their trust. Yet in her silence, in her determination, she had earned something no amount of shouting or strength could buy. They now whispered about her not as the trainee who fell, but as the one who inspired loyalty so deep that even aliens broke rank to protect her. As days passed and she walked slowly through the halls of the academy, she noticed how eyes followed her, not with pity but with acknowledgement. For the first time, she felt seen, not for her power or her endurance, but for the bond she carried. Even those who once doubted her now nodded in quiet approval, aware that what had happened on the field had already become part of the academy's lessons. The tale spread like fire through whispered stories in the barracks and echoed in the conversations of instructors. The message was simple: strength was not always about never falling. Sometimes, true strength was revealed in the way others rose to stand with you when you could no longer stand yourself. She realized then that her collapse had been a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The cubs had shown that the bond between humanity and aliens was more than training drills, more than commands or orders. It was something deeper, something built on respect, care, and shared trust. The academy, once rigid in its discipline, now carried a new lesson born from her struggle. Her weakness had not diminished her. Instead, it had revealed a truth that would outlast any single drill. Respect is not demanded. It is earned, and sometimes it is earned in the quiet moments when strength finally falters. From that day forward, the story of the collapse was retold in the halls of the academy, not as a tale of failure, but as a reminder of something greater. New recruits would hear it whispered during long nights in the barracks, passed down as a kind of legend. They were told of the young human trainee who gave everything she had until her strength gave out, and of the alien cubs who chose to guard her with silent loyalty when she could no longer stand. The instructors, who once relied on harsh drills and rigid rules, began to use the moment as an example in their lessons. True strength, they would say, is not shown only in endurance, but in the bonds that hold when endurance ends. It was a simple truth, but one that carried a weight that no rule book had ever managed to teach. The cubs, who had been seen as wild and sometimes unpredictable, were now remembered as symbols of loyalty. Their choice to shield the fallen human without hesitation was repeated in every retelling, and recruits often found themselves inspired by the thought of such trust. Some wondered aloud how the bond had formed, how quiet determination and respect could inspire such a response. Others understood it as proof that humanity's worth in the academy was not measured by brute power alone, but by the ability to connect, to inspire, and to lead without demanding. As time passed, the details of that day grew into a story larger than the event itself. The sun was described as harsher, the distance longer, the silence heavier when she collapsed. The cub's circle of protection was spoken of as unbreakable, a living shield that no one dared cross until she herself gave them leave. Every retelling added a touch of awe, but the heart of the story never changed. Strength had faltered, but loyalty had endured, and from that endurance, respect was born. Even outside the academy, the tale traveled. Visitors from other units heard it and carried it back to their own camps. Soon, across training fields far away, recruits who had never seen the young trainee or the cubs repeated the story as if it had happened before their own eyes. It was no longer about one person or one moment. It had become a shared lesson, carried like a quiet torch. For the human trainee, there was no fame or special recognition. She returned to her drills, slower at first, then stronger, knowing that whispers followed her. But she did not walk taller because of pride. She walked with a calm awareness that she had lived through something that would outlast her. Strength may falter, she knew, but the bond it inspires never fades. And in the end, that was the story everyone chose to remember. Not the stumble, not the fall, but the circle of loyalty that rose when she could not.